Wait, you quit Wall Street to sell coffee? My sister's voice cut through the chatter, loaded with disbelief. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for confirmation that this was some twisted prank. You're throwing away a six-figure job for a latte stand? She repeated, louder this time, as if volume could jolt me back to reality. The laughter that followed, low, disbelieving, tinged with mockery, still rings in my ears. It seemed like every relative at that table found something hilarious or tragic about the idea of me, a near-decade finance veteran, tossing my power suits aside to roast beans. After all, I'd spent so many years climbing the ladder, making connections, and surviving in one of the most intense arenas on earth, New York's financial district. I'd risen to a manager's position in a male-dominated environment, earning the kind of paycheck my parents never dared to dream of. By all appearances, I had made it, but every day I felt like I was sinking further into a life that didn't belong to me. Tired of suits, tired of forced smiles, tired of living for someone else's bottom line. I was just tired. So I left. I traded in my blazers for beans, and my family's reaction was swift and merciless. I grew up in a small town in Ohio, where ambition often felt like a hush we weren't encouraged to speak out loud. No one in my immediate family had finished college. My parents took on multiple jobs just to keep our household afloat. I remember them always pushing me to study, to excel, to rise above the sort of dead-end realities they lived with. From a young age, the dream was hammered into my head. Get a degree, move to a big city, make serious money, and never look back. Even as a child, I internalized that hustle mentality. School was my battlefield, and I fought for the top grades. Eventually, I was admitted to a prestigious university, the first in the family to do so. When I graduated with honors in finance, I felt like I had climbed the tallest mountain I could see. My parents and siblings looked at me like I was unstoppable. They pinned all their hopes of a better life on me. Wall Street seemed like the next logical step, the place where the unstoppable went to conquer. It was intense, challenging, and competitive, but it promised the kind of status that made my family proud. Working on Wall Street was like being dropped into a pressure cooker of ambition and adrenaline. In the mornings, I sprinted past crowds to make it to the trading floor on time. During the day, I was juggling multiple deals, analyzing spreadsheets, and brushing off the casual sexism that came with a patriarchal culture. Nights bled into early mornings as I combed through data or nursed another triple-shot espresso just to keep going. My colleagues were mostly men, and for a while, it felt empowering to hold my own among them. I was the first in my family to reach this level. It felt monumental, like I was setting an example of what could be achieved through relentless drive. But for all my achievements, something gnawed at me. A hollow emptiness that no bonus or promotion could fill. I started to realize that the prestige of my title didn't equate to happiness. Instead, it became a label that I clung to because I didn't know who I'd be without it. I felt obligated to keep going because my family's pride and security were on the line. I was successful on paper, but deep inside, I was losing touch with my own heart. I remember one night, staring at my reflection in the tinted windows of the office tower, long after everyone else had gone home. Exhaustion pressed against my temples, and I could almost hear the hum of fluorescent lights drilling into my skull. I asked myself, is this it? Was this the life I was meant to live? A life of financial spreadsheets, cutthroat negotiations, and a soul that felt strangled by constant stress? The question lingered, but I pushed it aside. After all, who was I to complain about a job that paid me more than my entire family combined had ever made in a year? I told myself I should be grateful. Yet each time I looked at the reflection of my tired eyes, I recognized a woman on the edge of burnout. My mother's voice echoed in my mind, telling me not to blow this opportunity, reminding me I was the family's big success story. The guilt of wanting something else weighed heavily on me. Leaving finance felt like betraying my family, but staying felt like betraying myself. I never would have guessed that coffee, of all things, would eventually become my lifeline, my way out of that gilded cage. Coffee, for me, had never been just a beverage. It was a memory, a moment, a calm in a storm. When I was growing up, my grandmother, everyone called her Nana Lou, would get up before sunrise to start the day's chores. She'd make herself a simple cup of coffee, black, no sugar, and sip it slowly while sitting on the back porch. Sometimes I'd wake up early just to join her. The aroma drifting from her mug was comforting in a way words can't capture. Even though our house was cramped and money was tight, those moments with Nana Lu made everything feel okay. As if life's heaviness momentarily lifted in the steam rising from that mug. It was more than a drink. It was a ritual, a small, sacred pause in the day. Over the years, as I juggled the mania of college and Wall Street, coffee morphed into a necessary fuel, triple shots, venti lattes, whatever I needed to keep going. But underneath that functional relationship, I still remembered the feeling of calm from those mornings with Nana Lu. I didn't just want to gulp coffee in the name of caffeine. I wanted to savor it, celebrate it, let it ground me. When a close friend invited me to a local coffee cupping event one weekend, I was hesitant. After all, I had a massive workload, and spending a Saturday sniffing and slurping different coffees felt like a luxury I didn't have time for. But curiosity won out. I went and found myself utterly enthralled by the process. Careful measures, notes of chocolate or citrus, the swirl of a spoon to release the aroma. I learned about beans grown on small farms, about ethical sourcing, and about how big corporations often exploited farmers in developing countries. For the first time in years, something lit a spark in me. I saw an entire world in these beans, stories of families, landscapes, and traditions. And something clicked. Coffee wasn't just a mundane commodity. It was a canvas for connection, for doing things the right way. I started reading up on the coffee supply chain, devouring articles and YouTube videos that taught me about roasting techniques, fair trade practices, and sustainable packaging. An idea took root in my mind. What if I started my own brand? A brand dedicated to ethical sourcing, small batch roasting, and giving back. That was the day Hollow and Hearth was born in my mind. From the moment I had the vision for Hollow and Hearth, I couldn't shake it. I'd be staring at financial charts in my office, yet all I could think about was how to scale a coffee business. I was terrified by how pulled I felt toward this idea. At one point, I drafted a meticulous spreadsheet of startup costs, sourcing possibilities, and marketing strategies, an odd fusion of the skill set I'd honed on Wall Street with my budding passion for coffee. Each row of that spreadsheet called me to trade my cubicle for a roastery, my suits for aprons. Finally, I hit a breaking point. I had stayed late to finalize a massive deal, and as I packed up my laptop, I felt nothing. No pride, no excitement, only dread. It was like the final puzzle piece snapping into place. I couldn't continue living a life that felt so misaligned. That weekend, I typed up my resignation letter, heart pounding in my chest. The gravity of this choice was overwhelming, but I also felt strangely calm, like a diver standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing the leap was both terrifying and absolutely necessary. I was ready to jump. My family's reaction was the complete opposite of that calm resolve I felt in my gut. I flew home to Ohio for my mother's birthday, suspecting that this might be the last normal family gathering before everything changed. Over dinner, I broke the news. My sister's face went slack with disbelief, and my father spat out a question. Why would you leave the only good thing you have? My mother covered her mouth, tears brimming at the thought of her overachieving daughter, throwing it all away. My other siblings peppered me with questions, each more dismissive than the last. Do you even know how to run a business? This is what people do when they have a midlife crisis, Rachel. It all felt like a personal attack. A rejection, not just of my decision, but of me. And yet, I couldn't blame them. I was supposed to be their shining star, the embodiment of success. Now I was pivoting to something they saw as menial, maybe even laughable. My throat tightened as I tried to explain the difference between generic coffee chains and what I wanted to create. But their faces remained unconvinced, and all I could feel was an unspoken heaviness settling in the room. I returned to New York and poured my life savings into Hollow and Hearth. No fancy investors, no safety net. Just my personal bank account, which thinned out alarmingly fast. My pristine apartment soon resembled a makeshift warehouse. Boxes of green coffee beans stacked up in the hallway. Packaging supplies filled my living room. My once tidy kitchen overflowed with sample roasts, filters, and test brews. My days stretched to 20 hours as I tried to fill every role at once. roaster, marketer, sales rep, accountant, and customer service agent. I delivered freshly roasted beans by hand to local cafes, hoping they'd take a chance on a brand new supplier. Most of them offered polite smiles, but few orders trickled in. Without the prestige of big finance behind me, I was just another scrappy entrepreneur, hustling for attention in a sea of competitors. I remember nights I'd crawl into bed at 3 a.m., my entire body aching, my mind racing with the question, did I make a huge mistake? The adrenaline that had fueled my leap of faith began to fade, replaced by an unrelenting exhaustion. Yet, amid the chaos, the aroma of roasting coffee continued to soothe me, a reminder of why I had started in the first place. Month after month, my savings dwindled further. I tried boosting online sales with social media ads, but each campaign felt like screaming into the void. I felt guilty for every dollar I spent because it was money I technically didn't have. I'd watch these slick corporate coffee chains roll out massive marketing campaigns and wonder how I'd ever compete. Bills piled up. I ended up moving to a smaller apartment in Queens just to keep costs down. My new place was cramped, but at least the rent was manageable. When people on the street asked me what I did for a living, I hesitated. Part of me still wanted to brag about my Wall Street background because saying, I roast coffee felt underwhelming. But I swallowed that pride. This was the path I'd chosen. Some nights, I roasted small batches for online orders until the sun peeked through the window, then spent my mornings hunched over my laptop, responding to customer emails or hustling for more leads. Despite it all, something kept me going. Every so often, a customer would message me saying they loved the taste, that it was the best coffee they'd had. Those small praises became my lifeblood. The uncertainty hovered like a storm cloud. I racked up credit card debt to cover expenses I hadn't anticipated, like repairs on my roaster and packaging mishaps that led to hundreds of bags printed incorrectly. My phone calls to home became shorter and fewer. I couldn't stand hearing my mother's disappointment or my father's tight-lipped silence. Once, during a half-hearted conversation, my dad slipped in, "You can always come back and get a real job." It hurt more than I cared to admit. But still, I pressed on, clinging to my belief that Hollow and Hearth could work. I lived for the rare moments when a local cafe would place a modest order and a new barista would mention how well the beans extracted. That feedback was golden. Yet, the financial reality was brutal. I missed the stability of my Wall Street salary, but I reminded myself, I never missed the emptiness. Late at night, I'd run my hands over the bags of coffee, reminding myself that each bean was a story, that my grandmother's tradition of sipping coffee in the quiet dawn was alive in me. I told myself if I could just hang on, something had to give. By the time the first anniversary of Hollow and Hearth rolled around, I was almost too exhausted to celebrate. My bills were overdue, and I was behind on rent. My phone buzzed incessantly with calls from credit card companies. Each unanswered ring felt like a dagger of shame. My parents mostly stopped calling at that point, and I resented their radio silence. Didn't they want to check in? Even if they disapproved, I was still their daughter. My siblings barely acknowledged the business. When they did, it was with an air of condescension. "How's that coffee thing going?" they'd say, as if it were a passing hobby. I tried to exude confidence, but anxiety festered inside me. Late at night, I'd sob into my pillow, wondering if they were right, if I was indeed a fool. The memory of that dinner table, full of doubt and mockery, replayed in my head like a broken record. And each replay left me feeling more isolated. A bleak part of me whispered, "Go back to finance, go back to safety." But the thought of returning made my stomach churn. I couldn't betray myself again. I had to ride this out, no matter how uncertain. Loneliness was my constant companion. I felt it in the quiet of my roastery, in the echo of an empty inbox when I hoped for an order. My body was in physical pain from roasting small batches late into the night, then lugging them around town for deliveries by day. The city felt colder, harsher. I'd see former colleagues on Instagram sharing photos of their corporate retreats, their big bonuses, and newly purchased condos. Meanwhile, I was rationing groceries, stuck with the heavy scent of coffee in my clothes and a flickering hope in my heart. I started to question my worth. What if all those years on Wall Street had been my peak? Had I just let go of my only chance at a stable, successful life? The self-doubt was suffocating, and it slowly strangled the positive voice inside me. Every missed call from my family felt like a silent condemnation of my choices. I worried I was disappointing everyone, including myself. At one particularly low point, I actually wrote a draft email to a finance headhunter, asking to be considered for any open positions. My finger hovered over the send button, but something inside me refused to click. A turning point came when a local food blogger, Amanda Song, stumbled upon Hollow and Hearth by pure accident. She had ordered some beans for a small batch coffee taste test series on her blog. When she posted her review, she raved about the flavor complexity, the ethical sourcing story, and the passion embedded in every cup. I was shocked to see a sudden spike in web traffic. My phone buzzed with new orders. It was a glimmer of hope in a sea of disappointment. I remember refreshing my sales dashboard, my heart pounding as the numbers climbed. It wasn't thousands of orders, but it was enough for me to realize people like what I'm doing. Encouraged, I reached out to Amanda to thank her. She was surprisingly warm, inviting me to chat for her podcast. That podcast interview, where I poured my heart out about leaving Wall Street to pursue coffee, connected with listeners. Orders doubled, then tripled over the course of a month. Suddenly, I was scrambling to keep up. The late nights I spent roasting didn't feel so draining anymore. This wasn't some fluke. It was the first sign that I might be on the right track after all. A short while later, a small regional grocery chain called Riverbend Foods reached out. They wanted to carry Hollow and Hearth in a few pilot stores. I had no idea how to handle wholesale logistics at that scale. I was still roasting in a cramped apartment setup and packaging by hand. But I said yes without hesitation, promising I'd figure it out. I scrambled to find a shared commercial kitchen space in Brooklyn so I could produce larger quantities. My days became a frenzy of phone calls, coordinating deliveries, and drafting supply contracts. And yet, I felt alive. The brand was starting to grow from a tiny seed into something tangible, something that could support me if I managed it wisely. When the first few bags hit Riverbend's shelves, I nearly cried. This was the dream made real. Seeing my coffee in a store, next to established brands that once seemed light years out of reach. Family and friends, while those who still spoke to me congratulated me timidly, as if waiting for the other shoe to drop. But for once, I felt proud, without reservation. I was no longer just existing on adrenaline and faith. I had small but meaningful momentum on my side. Then 2022 arrived with a swift and merciless blow. The economy took a nosedive, dragging consumer confidence with it. Suddenly, discretionary purchases like specialty coffee were on the chopping block. Sales dipped, wholesale orders paused, and I felt the rug being pulled out from under me. As if that weren't bad enough, my suppliers, small family-owned farms, were also suffering. Environmental factors and rising costs forced them to increase their prices. My slim margins evaporated. Contracts I'd landed with local cafes were canceled or put on hold indefinitely. Riverbend Foods began downsizing their specialty offerings. In a matter of weeks, I saw months of progress slip through my fingers like sand. The stock market crash also hit my personal investments hard. My emergency fund, that final safety net, disappeared in a cloud of red numbers. I maxed out my credit cards to keep the business afloat, to pay my suppliers on time, and to cover rent on the roastery. It felt like every door was closing simultaneously. The gnawing fear returned, more vicious than before. I'd stare at my brand's logo, the minimalist hearth design, and wonder if it would all vanish, leaving me with nothing but debt and regret. Desperation colored every decision. I applied for small business loans, but with the market in chaos, banks were skittish. My phone calls to potential investors were met with polite rejections or outright ghosting. The cost of packaging materials skyrocketed, and shipping delays wreaked havoc on my carefully planned schedule. Each setback felt like a gut punch. My mental health deteriorated to the point where I dreaded checking email, terrified another vendor would back out. I considered scaling down, but that would mean cutting my supply orders, a move that would devastate the farmers I'd vowed to support. So, I held on. Every night, I sank into bed feeling the weight of uncertainty pressing down on me. The fear was constant, but behind it, there was still a flicker of defiance. I'd come too far to give up now. Whenever I thought about quitting, I remembered the emptiness I'd felt on Wall Street, that sense of living someone else's life. If nothing else, I owed it to myself to fight for Hollow and Hearth. But I had no idea how close I was to a breakthrough, how a single email would soon light the path out of the darkness. One chilly morning, as I was nursing a mug of my own roast and feeling utterly defeated, an email arrived. The subject line read, "Whole Farm Market Inquiry." My heart fluttered. Whole Farm Market was a massive, nationally recognized grocery chain known for stocking ethical, quality products. I had pitched them months ago in a Hail Mary-type move, but never heard back. Now, out of nowhere, they wanted to set up a call to discuss carrying Hollow and Hearth in their specialty coffee aisle. My hands trembled as I read their questions. Could I handle larger-scale distribution? Did I have the certifications in place for nationwide shipment? My immediate reaction was panic. Technically, I was in financial freefall, but a stronger feeling took over. I couldn't let this chance slip away. I responded with a confident absolutely, setting up a video call for later that week. The moment I hit send, I felt a surge of adrenaline that banished the doom and gloom, at least temporarily. Could this be real? Had I finally found a lifeline when I was on the brink of drowning? For the first time in a long while, hope felt tangible, not just a whisper in the dark. The call with Whole Farm Market's buying team was nerve-wracking. I'd expected them to be cold, maybe skeptical, but they were genuinely curious about my story. They asked about my sourcing methods, how I supported the farms, my roasting process, and my future plans. I spoke passionately, referencing everything from the fateful cupping event that sparked my dream to the small-scale farmers who poured their hearts into each bean. By the end, they seemed convinced that Hollow and Hearth had something special. Shortly thereafter, an official purchase order arrived for nationwide distribution, an opportunity that required me to scale up at lightning speed. Suddenly, I was no longer delivering bags by hand or scrounging for packaging. I needed a larger roastery, a bigger team, and professional logistics. Investors who had ignored me before now returned my calls, lured by the whole farm deal. I secured enough funding to move into a proper facility in New Jersey. My brand, once a tiny seedling, was sprouting into something real and robust. The shift was almost dizzying. One minute I was staring at empty bank accounts, the next I was forging partnerships with big retailers. I felt like I'd been handed a second chance, maybe even a miracle. News travels fast in the retail world. After Whole Farm Market's endorsement, other major outlets took note. Target approached me about a pilot program in select urban locations. Greenway Grocers, known for their focus on local goods, also placed a sizable order. Boutique cafes, impressed by the newfound buzz, reached out for wholesale contracts. I found myself hiring staff, first a roaster's assistant, then a sales manager, then a small marketing team to handle social media and outreach. With each new hire, I felt a mixture of terror and excitement. These people were relying on me for their livelihoods, but they believed in the mission of Hollow and Hearth and helped me refine every aspect of the operation. Suddenly, my brand wasn't just paying my bills, it was supporting a growing workforce. Investors projected our valuation to climb above $100 million within a few years if we continued to expand at this rate. The number felt unreal, like it belonged in some dream version of my life. But it was happening. I found myself in boardrooms discussing partnerships and joint ventures. Yet through it all, I tried to stay grounded, remembering how quickly fortunes can change and how lonely it had been at rock bottom. Despite the skyrocketing success, I avoided flaunting it. In the era of social media bragging, I chose a different path. I wore the same worn-in jeans and hoodies I'd always worn. My phone was still an older model. My car, a 10-year-old sedan I'd bought used back in my Wall Street days, was still reliable enough for grocery runs. I never posted about our soaring valuation or the prestigious partnerships. In part, it was humility. After nearly losing everything, I wasn't keen on tempting fate. But there was another reason. My family. They still believed I was scraping by, struggling to make my coffee dream happen. We rarely spoke, which was painful but also a strange relief because I didn't have to face their skepticism. The few times we did talk, I didn't elaborate on my latest retail expansions or high-profile collaborations. Instead, I'd say, "Things are busy," or "I'm hanging in there." And that was usually enough. It was as if I needed to protect my success in a bubble, away from the negativity and disbelief I'd once faced. If I was going to reveal how far Hollow and Hearth had come, I wanted it to be on my own terms. Finally, the day came when I decided to invite my family for a visit. My mother hesitantly accepted. My father remained silent, and my sister asked, "Is there a place to stay, or should we book a motel?" I casually mentioned I had some space for them. What they didn't know was that I'd recently purchased a modern estate, a beautiful property outside the city, surrounded by tall trees and bathed in natural light. It was more than I'd ever dreamed of owning, purchased with the proceeds of success I'd never shown them. On the day they arrived, I watched from a balcony as their car pulled into the long driveway. My heart pounded. 1,000 thoughts danced through my mind. Would they judge me for hiding this? Would they still dismiss my achievements? I greeted them at the door, guiding them into the spacious living area. My sister's eyes widened. My mother looked around in stunned silence, her cheeks flushed. My father fidgeted, clearly uncertain how to react. Before anyone could say a word, I said, "Welcome. Let me show you around." I led them to a back room where some of my team had set up a tasting station. It was time for them to finally see what I'd built. In the roasting facility next to the house, the warm, earthy aroma enveloped us the moment we stepped inside. State-of-the-art equipment hummed softly. My head roaster greeted us, explaining the bean's origin and the meticulous roasting process. I saw the confusion on my family's faces shift slowly into awe. This was no humble latte stand. This was a real, thriving enterprise. I introduced them to members of my marketing and distribution teams, each excited to share their role in Hollow and Hearth's success. Stacks of packaged bags bore my brand's logo, an artistic take on a hearth, symbolizing the warmth of home. I showed them the analytics chart pinned to a board, lines steadily climbing, representing distribution channels and sales metrics. My sister was the first to break the silence, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "You built all this?" she whispered, almost disbelieving. My mother's eyes were misty, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch one of the branded bags. My father, stoic as ever, simply nodded, his eyes revealing more than words could say. In that moment, I felt a surge of pride, not driven by numbers, but by the sheer realization that they finally saw me. Back at the house, my sister cornered me in the kitchen. "Why didn't you tell us any of this?" she demanded, not angrily, but with genuine hurt in her voice. I took a deep breath, recalling all the times they had dismissed my dream. "Because," I said quietly, "you weren't listening when it was small." The words hung in the air, raw and true. I wasn't looking for an apology, but I needed her to understand that their lack of faith had wounded me more deeply than I'd ever let on. She blinked, tears forming at the corner of her eyes. "I'm sorry," she finally whispered. We didn't understand." I nodded, feeling a strange mix of sadness and relief. The rest of the evening was spent in an emotional haze as we dined together for the first time in years without tension or snide remarks. They asked questions about the farms I partnered with, how I found my roasters, how I managed to survive the hard times. For once, I could tell they genuinely wanted to learn. Justice didn't feel like revenge, it felt like finally being seen. And that, more than any flashy success, was what I'd been craving. Later that night, after my family had gone to bed, I stepped outside onto the patio overlooking the spacious yard. The moonlight illuminated the lawn, and a sense of calm settled over me. I thought about the journey, leaving a lucrative career everyone admired, sinking my life savings into a dream few believed in, grappling with self-doubt, and almost losing everything before a miracle email changed it all. In my darkest moments, I'd wanted to prove everyone wrong, to show them I wasn't crazy or irresponsible. But standing there, I realized this whole endeavor was never about proving them wrong. It was about proving myself right. I thought of a quote my grandmother loved. "Grow quietly and let your fruit speak." That's exactly what I had done. I trusted the small voice inside me that said, "There's more to life than ticking off society's boxes," and I fought like hell to make it real. As I looked out at the night sky, I felt a wave of gratitude. My advice to anyone on a similar path: trust your vision, build it step by step, and don't waste energy trying to convince those who refuse to see. Let your success speak for itself.